Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Noach, the second Torah portion in the book of Bereshit, Genesis. The portion of Bereshit detailed the creation of the world and Adam and Chava's brief stay in the Garden of Eden, their expulsion, Cain's murder of Abel. We learned of the first 10 generations of humanity, all of Adam's descendants, and by the end of the Parsha last week, Torah states, "And Hashem saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of his heart was only evil all the time. And Hashem regretted that he had made man upon the earth, and he became grieved in his heart. And Hashem said, I will blot out man, whom I created, from upon the face of the earth, from man to cattle, to creeping thing, to the fowl of the heavens, for I regret that I made them. But Noach found favor in the eyes of Hashem." With the exception of the righteous Noach, humanity turned against God altogether, and under man's influence, all of creation became saturated with evil. Even the animals, even the very physical world itself, was corrupted beyond repair. Game over. The first verse of our portion, chapter 6, verse 9, states, "Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Noach walked with God," as opposed to those who considered themselves to be supermen, who put themselves above other men, those who called themselves B'nai Elohim, as we read in chapter 6 and verse 4, the sons of God, because they made themselves into gods, into power brokers, the elite, those who took whatever they wanted for themselves, those decadent and depraved of the generation whose arrogance and desire for self-gratification ultimately destroyed the foundations of the world. As opposed to all these, Noach lived as a man, and not more than that. Living like a man is no small thing. It's a full-time job. Noach was a righteous man, we read. He lived according to the rules that are necessary for a man to live by, for the upkeep and advancement of society and humanity. He cared about the betterment of humanity. Indeed, our sages teach that he was the first to fashion agricultural tools for tilling the soil and for farming. This is precisely what made him into a perfect tzaddik for his time. And this is what is meant by God walked with Noach. Noach constantly acknowledged that he felt he needed divine aid to strengthen and uplift him. Many of the commentators understand that the corrupt sons of Elohim mentioned towards the conclusion of last week's portion in chapter 6 and verse 4 are the children of rulers, judges and officers who saw themselves above the law and not subject to accepted societal norms. Our sage's description of their downward moral spiral sounds chillingly familiar. The Midrash characterizes these people in this manner. Self-proclaimed demigods, they would do as they pleased. They expressed no thankfulness to God for the beautiful world they lived in, but on the contrary, they mocked him. Ultimately, they denied his existence. Their society was ruled by violence and aggression, the law of the jungle. Violent robbery, called Hamas, was institutionalized, even state-sponsored. Their sexual behavior was so depraved and immoral that even the animals were influenced to cohabit outside their species. These were men who took whatever they wanted. Women were seen as nothing but objects of pleasure, and these sons of God permitted themselves to take whatever women they wanted, even a bride from under her bridal canopy, even a married woman. In short, their arrogance bred corruption, led to the complete breakdown of morality, and brought about the destruction of the world. As opposed to these people, the Torah states, Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Again, Noach saw himself as a man, an ordinary person, responsible and regulated by all the rules and boundaries that the real God made for real human beings. He prayed to Hashem for heavenly aid and help not to fall. This recognition, modesty, and humility are what aided him and assisted him in becoming a righteous man, perfect in his generation. After the flood, Noach leaves the ark, brings offerings. God renews his covenant with humanity and with the world. We learn of the descendants of Noach, from whom were established the 70 nations of the world. As the verse states in chapter 10 and verse 32, these are the families of Noach's descendants, according to their generations, by their nations. And from these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. But after the generation of the flood, after the earth has healed, and presumably man collectively should have learned his lesson, just when we would have thought that humanity might just get it right, we encounter the saga of the generation of the dispersion, the builders of the Tower of Babel. Chapter 11 begins, Now the whole earth was of one language and common purpose. And it came to pass, when they traveled from the east, that they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them in fire. So the bricks were to them for stones, and the clay was to them for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered upon the face of the earth. And Hashem descended to see the city and the tower that the sons of man had built. And Hashem said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is what they have begun to do. Now will it not be withheld from them all that they have planned to do? Come, let us descend and confuse their language, so that one will not understand the language of his companion. And Hashem scattered them from there upon the face of the entire earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore he named it Babel, for there Hashem confused the language of the entire earth, and from there Hashem scattered them upon the face of the entire earth. What is this all about? Ostensibly, it doesn't seem like such a terrible thing to build a city and a tower. And the sins of the generation of the dispersion, whatever they were, as opposed to those horrendous deeds of the generation of the flood, they're not really spelled out. Rashi cites a discussion of our sages on this subject. Which sins were worse, those of the generation of the flood or those of the generation of the dispersion? He says the former did not stretch forth their hands against God, whereas the latter stretched forth their hands against God to wage war against him. Chapter 11 begins with the words, Now the whole earth was of one language and common purpose. These words, Dvarim Achadim, can indeed be translated as one language. In fact, Rashi tells us the whole world was speaking Hebrew. But Dvarim Achadim, in addition to uniform or one language, can also signify sharp words. According to the Midrash, the backstory is that they spoke against the unique one of the world. The people came with one scheme and said, God has no right to the upper regions. Let us ascend to the sky and wage war with him. Another idea, which we can touch upon later, is that they spoke sharp words against Abraham, who was introduced at the end of this portion. But perhaps the most amazing and perplexing insight of all, shared by the Midrash, is the statement that the people said, once every 1,656 years, the sky totters as it did in the time of the flood. Come and let us make supports for it. In other words, let's shore up the heavens. Let's be ready for the next flood. But where is the war being waged against God? Okay, so they were scientists concerned with climate change. They did research and concluded that the Great Flood wasn't an isolated incident, but an act of God, but the beginning of a pattern that would be repeating itself, and they wanted to be prepared for it. The first flood in Noah's time occurred 1,656 years AM, in the year of our world, after creation. So therefore, every 1,656 years, the floodgates will open? This is what they reasoned. So their intention in building the city and the tower so that they should not be scattered over the earth was to be in a position to brace up the heavens against future flooding, since according to their reasoning, once every 1,656 years, the sky totters and they want to build supports. So they wanted to build supports for heaven, but all this is taking place less than 400 years after Noah and the flood. And so the sages ask, why did they build it now, when according to their account, they still had more than 1,200 years to go before the next flood? If all this is confusing, let's begin at the beginning. The story really begins with a character called Nimrod. Chapter 10 and verse 8 we read, And Cush begot Nimrod. He was the first to be a mighty man on earth. He was a mighty hunter before Hashem. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Hashem. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, etc., in the land of Shinar. Nimrod, which could be translated as we shall rebel, was a grandson of Ham, father of Canaan, the line which Noach cursed to be slaves. Nimrod's goal was total mastery over others, over everyone, even over Hashem. He made himself king over the entire generation. But this was more than just an undeserved and usurped kingship. First of all, he really was the first king. There were no kings and there were no wars before him. he took control of the people of his generation. As the verse states, chapter 10, verse 9, he was the first to be a mighty man on earth. And there's a whole story about how he achieved this position through the garments of Adam, the very same garments which God himself fashioned for Adam and Eve before banishing them from the Garden of Eden. As it's stated in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 21, those garments were with Noah on the ark, and they found their way to Nimrod. They possessed special qualities, according to ancient teachings, which enabled the wearer to achieve domination over all the animals and beasts. When Nimrod wore these clothes, all the beasts of the field came and bowed before him. So people thought that it was his own power, but it was really only his clothes. He was just manipulating public opinion, but they made him king nonetheless. So Nimrod said to the people, "Let's build a city and dwell there, lest we be scattered. And we'll build a big tower there and climb up to heaven and make a great name for ourselves. Because of three things the earth trembles," it says in Proverbs 30:22. And the first is because of a slave who reigns, a reference to Nimrod. But the great Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch offers an amazing alternative translation of these verses based on the deepest understanding of who Nimrod was. He says, "And Cush gave birth to Nimrod. He started being a mighty man upon the earth. He was a crafty hero before God. Wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, a crafty hero before God." The verse, chapter 10 and verse 9, actually states, "Hu hechel lihiyot gibor." He was the first to be a mighty man on earth. Hechel really means started. So he started being a gibor, a mighty man on earth. But was he really the first? There had been giborim before him. We recall the sons of Elohim and the Nephilim. But Nimrod, he was the first to turn being a mighty man into a profession. Being a mighty man was the sum total of his nature and his entire life's mission. And this was his craftiness, his whole character, his whole position in life. He created this profession through exercising considerable force, physical bodily force. He's strong-armed. He was calculating, ruthless, and cunning, but mostly he was just plain overpowering, and all in the service of himself. And he wasn't just a gibor. The verse tells us that he was a gibor tzayid, a hunter. And as Rav Hirsch expounds, it's this modification that makes his profession of gibor so ominous. He wasn't a hunter of animals, but a gibor who hunted and caught human beings. Nimrod was the first man to blend violence with cunning to catch men for his plans. The first to be a mighty man on earth. Nimrod was a mighty hunter before Hashem, the verse tells us. That doesn't mean in the name of Hashem, in the name of God, but rather testifies to his misuse of the name of God. He suppressed his fellow men at first in Hashem's name, the very name which stands for love and kindness and freedom for all people. At first, he cloaked his domination under the ruse of it being pleasing to God, and then he demanded recognition of his power in the name of God, but ultimately he himself became a god. He was the first, the prototype of all those who craftily crown themselves with a halo of self-proclaimed holiness, but whose real agenda is nothing less than the enslavement of men. And indeed, the enslavement, the mental enslavement of men, the destruction of the individual, the crushing of the individual will and spirit in the name of community, in the name of advancement, in the name of progress and technology. This was Nimrod's goal. As the verse attests, this plain of Shinar was the territory where Nimrod began his reign. But our sages teach that there were no stones in this valley of Babylon. Thus, and they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them in fire." So the bricks were to them for stones, and the clay was to them for mortar. This was a place, Nimrod chose, where all building material was lacking, and so they had to seek to create artificial, man-made stones. Not the stones that Hashem provides for building. We don't need him or his help. They joined forces not only to overcome that limitation, but to master nature. Not only to master nature, but to subdue God himself and any need for him. As a community focused on seizing complete control, they fancied that they would be invincible. They dedicated themselves to making something that would serve as a perpetual reminder of the power of the community over the individual. Nimrod set up what he sold as a model community, all for one and one for all. But without Hashem, with the elimination of the divine image in which each individual man was created, there is no community. There's only exploitation. Thus, a famous teaching informs us that the project of building the tower reached a level of organization and mechanization that surely must have been the wonder of the world. But in a chilling revelation of just how the community was valued over the individual, in a disturbing vision of the role of technology in man's life, the sages teach us that when a stone, hoisted and raised towards the top of the tower with an elaborate system of pulleys and ramps and cranes, when a building stone inadvertently slipped and dropped to the bottom, everybody would stop their work and wail and cry bitterly for the setback and delay in completion. But when a human being, a fellow worker, fell to his death, everybody kept right on working without pausing for a moment. So the avowed goal of this project was to cast the kingdom of heaven from upon them, and Hashem let them. He set them up. This is the meaning of Psalms chapter 2 and verse 4. He who sits in heaven will laugh. Hashem will mock them. So through this tower, under Nimrod's leadership, the people of this generation sought to prevent another flood, really meaning that after banishing God from the lives of men and from the earth altogether, they wanted to usurp his position. They knew very well that the reason for the flood had been the sins of that generation. But their goal was for them to determine the fate and direction of mankind and the administration of life on earth. Get out of here, they said. You stay up there on top, we'll take over the bottom. Thus, open up the heart in the deepest way. This tower in the valley of Shinar was designed as the twinner, the negative image of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. They wanted their tower, their dark tower, to be the guiding light for mankind. This was nothing less than a war of the wills. Their will against Hashem's. They were united in their decision to build one city, with all in agreement that not one person should be willing to give themselves over to do Hashem's will. Check him at the door before coming into this city. Their goal was to ignore God altogether. They reasoned that if there would be not one man in the entire world who was prepared to do Hashem's will, they could succeed in banishing him from the earth, and therefore there would never be another flood because he would have no influence in this world. He would have to sever his connection to it. So the tower was merely a symbol of their unity. According to their reasoning, it was their unity, their single-minded blacklisting, banishing of Hashem, which would prevent another flood. This is the idea expressed by the Midrash as they were making supports to prop up heaven. But understand this, the real reason for getting everybody to move to that city was in order to quash every individual's identity and aspiration, to ensure total mind control, that there should not be even one man on earth who accepted Hashem, as did Noach in his time. See, in Noah's time, they reasoned, Hashem administered his justice on the earth and kept up his relationship, his influence with the world, as it were, for the sake of his relationship with Noah, whom he entrusted with the continuation of life on earth after the flood. Thus the Midrash teaches that when they came to build the city and the tower, they sent after Avraham to join them. They sent word to Avraham to try and enlist his support and win him over to their way of thinking. Knowing what a truly righteous tzaddik he was, how he lived literally only to do Hashem's will, they were initially afraid that he would ruin everything, their plans, and that on his account, Hashem would still be interested in wanting to be involved with this world. But ultimately, even though Avraham obviously refused to join them, they were no longer concerned because they reasoned that since Avraham had no child, no heir, to continue his spiritual path, his relationship with Hashem is only temporary, and the same regarding Hashem's relationship with the world. And this is the meaning of the interpretation that they said, Devarim Chadim, sharp words against Avraham. But why did they build it now, at the end of the second 1,000, way before the time when, according to their own calculations, another flood could be expected? The great Ramchal explains, this period was a special destiny-charged time in human history, a time, he calls it, of putting down roots. See, before the sin of Adam, Adam was indeed a very lofty spiritual being. It was a very different level of man. And as a result of his action in the garden, Adam descended greatly and his spiritual nature was dulled, sullied. He descended to a lower level and with him all of humanity. But these were still formative years populated by great, massive souls who had the potential to elevate all humanity. Hashem was still presenting the people of this generation with the opportunity to rise to man's formal level, to uplift all of humanity for the future as well, to regain their lost status. This was for a limited time in Hashem's wisdom, this time of humanity's roots. It was to be up until the generation of the dispersion. And these people, the people of the generation of the dispersion, they were huge souls. Here we are standing at an influential time in the development of human history. Literally, we're standing at the threshold of human history. They had immense potential, but once again, they made bad choices. They wanted all the power and control for themselves. They knew that they were coming to the end of this special preordained time, the time of the roots, and they wanted to make sure that humanity's course was set all right, without Hashem's presence in the world. Therefore, it was imperative for them to unify now and make sure that not one person would be interested in serving Hashem. The tower versus the holy temple. To steal the shefa, the divine influence of blessing in the world, and to reroute it through their own twisted egos. Making a name for ourselves, the enslavement of mankind to false values, the destruction of the individual, the deification of false leaders, the worship of technology, the lust for fame, the desire to be in control, the desire to be God. Have we learned anything? These Torah portions remind us that we're not in control, that we need to appreciate Hashem in our lives, and we need to appreciate and recognize our own limitations. Like Noach, we need to acknowledge that we are people in Hashem's world, in Hashem's plan, who need God, who desperately want Him in this world, and who live by boundaries and rules. This is our turn to be alive. This is how we take our place in the march of the generations and reflect the divine image in which we were created.